My name is Rob Tullis. I'm an architect and developer and the director of design for the GID Urban Development Group here in Boston. And I'm filling in today for Christina Lanzel, who's the chair of the BSA's Placemaking Network. And I think, as most of you know, Christina is studying in Germany this fall and will return in February. As most of you know, the Placemaking Network meets on the third Monday of each month to discuss issues involved in the creation of distinctive places. And today we have a wonderful presentation on the role and requirements of retail in such places. Next month, we will not meet here in the Architects Building, but are instead sponsoring a seminar, not an open meeting, but a seminar, at Build Boston on Wednesday, November 17th at 1 p.m., which I urge you all to attend. I am presenting it. Whoop, there goes the elevator again.
Just keep it interesting.
It's a bad location. I know, it's a bad location of the switch. That seminar will be entitled Life in the Square, the Role of the Public Plaza in Urban Placemaking. And I'm presenting it along with Josh Simoneau, who's the 2008 Roach Traveling Scholarship winner, who spent last year traveling through Europe, spent 330 days in Europe and documented over 50 public places. And presenting it also with Kathy Madden, who's an executive VP at New York's Project for Public Spaces, who co-wrote the book How to Turn a Place Around, which is probably their biggest book, and regularly lectures and leads workshops on the issues associated with creating viable active places. So again, that Build Boston seminar is number A43. It's called Life in the Square. It begins at 1 p.m. on Wednesday, November 17th. I look forward to seeing all of our Placemaking Network participants there. I currently don't have programs identified for December and January, so if you know of someone who would be willing to talk at the Placemaking Network or have any ideas for topics, please let me know and I will try and round up some speakers. I am working on something for December and January, but I don't have any yet. Which leads us to today's talk. Today I'm pleased to introduce our presenters, Chris Milne and Robin Mosle, who will speak about the design of successful retail-based places, including the characteristics of successful retail environments, formal tools that can be used to create an active retail edge to public space, the needs of retail leasing and how it impacts form, and the types of activities that developers seek to integrate into retail places. Chris Milne is a senior associate at Elkus Manfredi Architects, a Boston-based firm known for their wide range of quality planning, architecture, and interiors work, and their collaborative design process, and their approach to partnering with their clients, one of whom is Robin Mosle. Chris has had extensive training and experience in North America, the UK, and throughout Europe. Her broad design experience extends across a varied scope of buildings, from the award-winning housing and shops in London and Toronto, the BFAS Gallery in Geneva, the Broad Institute in Cambridge, the upcoming, is it Tyco or? Tico restaurant in Boston's Back Bay, and more recently, master planning and design work of the individual buildings in the mixed-use development in the Fenway Triangle with Samuels Associates. Robin Mosle is an executive VP at Samuels Associates. They are Boston-based developers who build on 3 generations of family involvement in the real estate development and retail center industry to envision and create retail-oriented places that range from small neighborhood centers to enclosed malls and large urban mixed-use developments. Robin has nearly 30 years of experience in real estate and leasing retail. In her position, she oversees all commercial and residential leasing and marketing efforts. Prior to joining Samuels and Associates, Robin spent 5 years with Streetworks, where she was a partner in the Blueback Square project, a 550,000 square foot, $200 million mixed-use development project in West Hartford, Connecticut. Robin also honed her broad asset management, development, and leasing expertise at Federal Realty Investment Trust, Grosvenor International, and the Rouse Companies. Both of these ladies have great experience and insights on what it takes to create successful retail-oriented places, and on the often conflicting and competing requirements of those places. And I've had the privilege to work with both of them. So I turn it over to you.
Thank you. I've been introduced, so I don't need to say any more about myself. Do you?
I don't need to say any more about myself either.
We'll just jump
So
right
we'll
in.
just jump right straight in. So we're here today to talk to you about streetscape, retail, and placemaking, which are all very integral to one another. And I wanted to start by looking at streets around the world and in the USA that really have left a memorable impression, at least on me, because I think that's very much what placemaking is about. It's creating memorable places that you want to return to or revisit or put into a presentation, but they set out a criteria or parameters of how you can create better places when we are working together with people like Sounds and Associates. In Lisbon, you have Rua Augusta, which is a fabulous street lined with retail in a very historic area of Lisbon. But you have restaurants spilling out and creating very colorful streetscape activity with the seats and the furniture and the people and the activity that goes along with that. It's very intimate, it's pedestrianized, and it has very the Portuguese are renowned for their streetscape paving, the way that they actually create very beautiful graphics onto the sidewalks. The Grove in LA, which integrates large and small park areas directly within their retail spaces themselves, so they actually feel very intimate between the edges of what is the park space and the retail shop itself, so you can engage in both activities, whether it be shopping or actually sitting around looking at the water. We all know Newbury Street, which is a great example of wide sidewalks and how they can really be activated with your restaurants and the bars. And we have so many different examples on Newbury Street of how that's actually achieved, where some restaurants are actually less transparent from the sidewalk edge, and some which, this is actually the old Giorgio Armani cafe. But it creates a real buzz and makes you want to return and participate in these activities. New York has many examples of brilliant retail streetscapes. And I always want to go back to New York and do my shopping. And they change in scale and they actually change in character. On Madison Avenue, it's very autonomous to the buildings adjacent to it, and we'll come back to this in a few minutes. But there is a formality to Madison Avenue compared to West Broadway down in Soho, where it's a little bit more rough, but it still has great character, and you can decide which kind of district or area you want to participate in depending on what your mood you're in during the day. But you can see on West Broadway there's very little guiding the signage, but it's great to have all this variety of signage and lighting and people meandering around. Everybody knows the great Parisian cafes that we like to participate in, and every corner in Paris you have a cafe, and I don't think there's enough of them in any city, and we should have them everywhere. North Michigan Avenue, which is a street that we come back to on a regular basis in our discussions because it has a very strong delineation of what the parameters are for the sidewalk definition between the point where the car pulls up to the actual storefront face, and it's integrating very strong guidelines to the landscaping and the material choices so that it really allows us to participate in a very rich definition of streetscape. King's Road in London, which is one of my favorite streets to shop in, and it is a predominantly single-story, very intimate retail street, which has now become actually very good for arts community as well, but it's within the very strict Georgian architecture of London. But it's a very, very successful street because this retail shops itself are very autonomous from the buildings above. And then we all know Italy, where it's as important to be seen on these streets as it is to actually be walking along the shops and looking into the shops. But they always use a great diversity of materials, even though they usually use quite neutral colors. They're always very beautiful marbles and granites on the floor, on the streetscape, as well as actually on the face of the buildings themselves. You always have to use Las Ramblas as one of the great streetscapes of the world.
It's required in every slideshow.
It is. It is gorgeous. It is colorful. It is active. It is formal. It's informal, and you could spend your whole day in Barcelona walking up and down Las Ramblas. And it's held at both ends by a great church. And at other ends takes you all the way down to the waterfront, but it's got galleries as you move down the street. So it's a great street for street frontage, and it's very wide, so it's really kind of like a boulevard, which is activated by boutiques and these little stores with restaurants and retail on the perimeter. And in Edinburgh, you have this great street, Victoria Street, which is in the old area of Edinburgh, which is full of antique bookshops and little boutiques. But it's a great example in Scotland for a very colorful streetscape. And every one of these streets have very similar criteria or ingredients that make up that memorable experience of walking and using these streets. But they're just used at different scales and different means, but they do create this great sense of streetscape.
Oh.
Did you?
Yeah. It doesn't look like you'll be able to read much of that, so
Yeah,
I'll
I'm kind of
have to tell that
surprised.
story. So I think that is a backdrop for that discussion. That's really what we both felt sort of puts everything in context. Everybody saw the sort of places that you might be walking in, and I think that's really what we are striving to figure out as a developer. So I'm looking at this from the developer side and saying, how can I make the place that we're creating matter? How can I make it significant? How can I make it have the energy and the activation of some of these precedents that we see around the world? And obviously it can't just be about design, because you have to lease it well and you have to get the right tenants and it has to make commercial sense. It has to be viable. But as long as you're trying to make it viable, are there things that you can do that will create a better place? And so we always start, and I have a little bit of history with this. I've been with about 5 companies, and I like to say that I started my the first time I was passionate was when I met Jim Rouse, who said that you needed to improve the quality of life in the communities in which you were doing business. That if you just built some center that made a lot of money, that was not going to be successful. It wouldn't be sustainable unless it added value to the community. And so that sort of stuck with me. And so, so when we look at streetscape and placemaking, it's first with the context of what can this place be so that it will work financially, but also have some meaning to it. And sometimes you're doing it on an existing street, so it's sort of already set up in terms of the grid with which you're working. And other times, like, what's the place in California? The Grove. You're starting with a clean slate, and you can do whatever you want there. So, so I like to think of streetscape or placemaking planning as having to do with everything that happens in the top 20 or 40 feet from the ground and everything that goes out about 20 feet. So this envelope here, never mind that it might have 17 stories or 30 stories or 3 stories or no stories, this envelope is where the customer is walking, where people are hopefully coming to experience life when they get outside of their homes. And so it's very critical that that has a sense of meaning. And so we start with developing a mission. And if we develop a mission, then we have an architect on board, we have an owner on board, we have the people who are leasing it on board. What is this place? As Chris said, is it South Broadway, or is it West Broadway in Soho, or does it feel like Madison Avenue? What's appropriate for this place? And that appropriateness, or that mission, you can call it whatever you want, a vision, a mission statement, will, out of that, if you stick to that and you always say, come on guys, this is what we said we were up to, then you probably won't get as lost. Still might get lost, but you probably won't get as lost. And so there are principles that guide us in organizing around that vision, so that every day in our work we make those decisions. And really, I like to actually include at the very beginning the branding. Some landlords don't think that you need to brand until you're actually marketing a place, but I think if you actually talk about the brand up front, it helps guide the design of the place. So, and then the most important experience is the pedestrian experience, whether they're shopping or not. So the pedestrian has to walk down the street and feel like, I want to be here. The stores matter, but the pedestrian matters more, because you can't just expect the stores to bring all the customers. It has to be a place where there's a lot of impulsive attendance, where people are just coming to recreate and experience their lives. So the pedestrian experience is tantamount to the whole mission, and then from that, every decision can be made. I define the streetscape by everything that happens outside of the storefront, and then the storefront itself is its own zone. And those two have to have some kind of marriage and some kind of an understanding, including the streetscape as it appears for not just cafes, but how do the retailers that are selling non-retail, non-food uses integrate well with the retailers that are selling food. That's sort of the overview of what we'll talk about today.
So when we start looking at what our guidelines are, we do need to have separate guidelines for district and separate guidelines for the tenant, but you really don't want to separate the two of them terribly too much, because they influence each other in terms of the holistic experience at the end. And they need to begin at the conceptual design stage. As Robin said, you need to have a mission at the very beginning to make sure that everything you're trying to achieve in the long run fits into that world. And so we did an analysis of how retail can fit into existing or base buildings. So you have the big 17-story structure and you're trying to activate it at its ground floor with retail. And it's something you need to think about, or we try to think about, at the very beginning. Because if you think about the streets that we looked at earlier on, there's a diversity of those shops. They're not all the same, and if they become all the same, then it gets very monotonous and it's not a real street. You want diversity and variety. So we broke it down into 3 categories, and recently we're looking at a mixed-use project, and we try to integrate all of these three different types of retail integration into this rather large mixed-use project, urban project. We look, first of all, there's autonomous retail, which, as we looked at earlier, the Madison Avenue example in the Kings Road, which is completely separate from the building itself. You can actually walk beside these retail shops and not even feel a sense of a building above you. So it's very much divorced, and it allows the retailer to have maximum flexibility in their branding capabilities, which is, the best opportunity for themselves. Completely divorced, but it's only one way of potentially...
I'm going to break in here because this has been a really good lesson for me. I think Chris might be the first architect with whom I've worked who has convinced me that this is not the only way to do it. And I've had many, many fights with architects over the years where I have said, with my pictures in hand, this is a wedding cake. I get the bottom layer, do what you want on top. And the architect screams back, if my building doesn't land, it won't make sense. You have to let my building land. It can't float in outer space. And this is, after 30 years of working in this business, the first time where I'm, through the process of us collaborating and trying to understand how we want our buildings to look and what matters, not whose ego is in the way, but actually what matters and what will make it feel as vibrant as we need it to. I'm happy to say that Chris has educated me about this.
Well, it's been a work in progress. But architects...
I softened her up for you. But
Yeah, that's right, Rob did. But we, as architects, I feel, especially where I come from, you want to create mega structures that have that personality drawn to the ground, and everything else that happens is, secondary. But the great streets that we like to walk down throughout the world aren't that way, and there is a complete diversity, and we should be realistic with that. And so the second option is that you get some integration of what I call the base building, or the primary structure, that may come down to the ground and touch the pedestrian edge, in which the retail store actually still has pretty strong branding capabilities. In the top right left-hand corner, you have the Peugeot store, and I think it's in Rome, and it has complete flexibility of how it wants to brand itself, but you still get the sense of the formal architecture coming down at the edges. So there's still some integration of the stuff that I like to do in terms of the big building compared to what's the tenant definition. And then there's the big ego, where we want the architecture to really define the environment that you're walking along. And so This is the toughest one for any retailer. It's an integrated retail strategy, and the retailer has to become very, very creative with their branding techniques, whether that's with signage or awnings or whatever means that they might use, and we're going to walk through those different ingredients. But in the top left-hand corner is a Barney's, and I can't remember which city it's in, but it's not a very exciting expression of their branding on a street compared to the Apple in London, which, well, first of all, it's a really pretty magnificent building anyway.
All they did was stick an apple
and they just
up
stick
there.
an apple up there, and it works. But it's fully integrated. And then the one on the right, which I
just wanted to talk about the one on the right because this was also part of my learning. So the one on the right is a building. It was the first building that Federal Realty bought in Bethesda, Maryland. I don't know if any of you have been to Bethesda, but it has evolved over the course of 15 years. So there was a lot of assemblage of land with existing buildings, and ultimately there were some new buildings built there, but primarily it was existing buildings. And this was the first building, and it was a rather new building. And so, of course, being the way we all were, oh my gosh, what are we going to do? This is horrible. Look at these gigantic columns that land on the ground. We can't scrape these columns and have the tenants put their brand up. So this was when we started really trying to figure out how can we have explosive branding for retailers within the context of an existing structure. So that's what we ended up doing. That, even if it's just something like a really great multicolored awning with some continuity and rhythm to it, nothing happened really to the storefront. Couldn't really do much.
And all three of these we try and integrate at the very, very beginning because it just adds to that whole story of diversity and variety along the pedestrian edge. So, and it happens at the conceptual level. It's not something that happens down in design development or CDs as an afterthought. It has to happen at the very beginning in terms of your strategies.
So this next section,
I have a feeling that the slide's not strong enough because of the overhead lights. I think the projection is going through that overhead light. Is there any way we can turn the lights
That
off?
wouldn't affect the projection.
Through the LED, you mean?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm not getting your.
If I knock out the backlight from on this one.
Yeah, it might be that one. I don't know what it is, but I don't think it's that one either.
I think it's the sunlight behind.
Oh, okay.
Oh, that's what it is.
That is exactly what it is.
That makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
And there's no curtain there. Just like 1603.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, that was, no, it's the light behind it. That's the problem. This next section, we're going to focus on just the sidewalk for a moment. Then we'll focus on the storefront. So sort of had a big picture overview of the things that matter. And sidewalks are great because Steve Samuels said to me about 3 months after he hired me, "You really are passionate about sidewalks, aren't you?" Because I'm always fighting about sidewalks, and I'm happy to say that the sidewalk that we built at Trilogy, do you guys know Trilogy? In the Fenway, it's a building that has West Elm in it, and it has 17 stories of apartments. It has a terrible sidewalk. Like, it's awful. It just has 25 feet of concrete, nothing on it. And so I had at least the opportunity to say, that's a bad sidewalk. And now we don't want to do any more bad sidewalks. So we're going to talk about what matters in sidewalks. And sidewalks have so many variables. It's extraordinary, the things that you can do with sidewalks. Sidewalks can be outdoor museums. Sidewalks can be cafes. Sidewalks can have structure, not have structure. And sometimes you're dealt a card. The sidewalk here is 9 feet. What do you do about it? There are places on Newbury Street where the sidewalk feels like it's 2 feet. Walking around certain trees, and people have been allowed to bring their storefront out and that sort of thing. So it's great when you can start a sidewalk from scratch and really think through what will make it wonderful. Again, going back to that box that I drew, which is really where I think the whole mission happens for an experience. I like to think of the first, we're in section now. I like to think of the first piece of the box as the storefront zone. We use this little shop, what do you call this? When you use initials for something. Forgot the word? Acronym, thank you. So we use shop acronym. So there's the storefront zone, in which hopefully storefronts can undulate and sort of push in and push out and make something other than just a sheer wall there, and have some kind of energy and depth and interest to them. And then, if it's at all possible, based on the jurisdiction you're in, it would be wonderful if everyone then walked in what we call the hallway zone, so that outdoor dining would happen on the outside of the hallway, so that you weren't forced to walk and then move out past a restaurant and then walk back in and see storefronts. This is one of my very, very big passions, and it took 2 years to convince the jurisdiction in Bethesda that this was a good idea. Not yet successful in Boston, but it's a wonderful example. Unless you have a huge plaza, which is sort of just a big, or a piazza or something, you know, if you have a real sidewalk and you have to walk down and see sometimes clothing, sometimes food, sometimes service, it's terrible to be interrupted that way, and you really won't capture the energy of the storefront if the customer has to walk around the seating. So I like to think of this next section as the hallway. That's the hallway where everybody walks. And then outside the hallway is the outdoor zone. That's the living room. That's where there is something happening. It can be the trees as an arbor with outdoor dining. It can be where you put art. It can be fountains. It can be just plain old seating, just regular seating. And you can see as an example in here, I found in Chicago, there was actually a store that actually put living room furniture on the street. I thought that was great. It was right around the corner from Michigan Avenue, and it is outdoor furniture, but with big overstuffed cushions, and you just went in. It was a coffee shop. You went in and got your coffee, and then you just came out and sat on the cushions. Starbucks recently did that on Newbury between Dartmouth and Exeter. They put out soft seating out there. And then the last zone is the parking zone, where if you're lucky enough to have parallel parking, that parallel parking creates a buffer for the outdoor zone. And so you make it just big enough to open car doors and have people feel like if they're sitting in the outdoor zone, they're protected from the zooming of the cars going by. So that's sort of the hierarchy of a sidewalk.
And so then we break this down into what are the different elements that make up those different zones, or that you can incorporate into those different 4 zones that we work with. And first of all, there's the sidewalk materials. And in Boston, we like to use brick or concrete, typically. And there's lots of cities that like to integrate those with many other materials. And you want to think about the pattern, what type of stone or brick, and the coloration. Integrating branding into the sidewalk is very intriguing and exciting. It does cost money, and it means that your client needs to have a very early understanding of that investment from the outset. But it can dramatically change your experience. You know, we have concrete, as you say, in front of Trilogy, and even if you just had that as brick, it would have been a much better surface to walk along. Street furniture, which is always exciting, because I think that street furniture should really take on the character of your neighborhood. And you can buy stuff straight off the shelf and it can look like anywhere else, but you can get some pretty unique pieces of street furniture, whether it be your bench that's inhabiting the living room zone, or the tree grates, and what your trash cans are. And bicycle, now in most cities, you get a lot of very creative ways of how you lock up your bicycles on the street edge. And again, it's from the outset, there needs to be an understanding of how much you want to include in your budgeting from the very beginning, because if it's afterthought, you're buying the standard off the shelf. Landscaping is very important, and it goes from the landscaping of how you hang planters on the lamp posts to on North Michigan Avenue, where they have the great landscaping zone, which is completely seasonal. So landscaping should always be seasonal all year round. It wants to be activated and can be integrated with lighting and art and become very playful in terms of animating your streetscape. Lighting itself is, we think about it hierarchically because you want to think about branding, how you light the buildings above and how that contrasts or interacts with your tenant lighting below, how you're lighting your landscaping, which can activate the edge on the other side of the sidewalk from the retail store, and accent lighting throughout, which adds a little bit more special touch. but it's also can be seasonal in some respects, those landscaping and accent lightings. But lighting is a very, very important feature, and it is not the cheapest. You can't really solve it with very cheap methods. You have to think about it very early on to get the interest. You can see on the Grove on the left, there's a lot of activity going on with lighting, which is a really great example of different scales of lighting.
So I just want to say one thing about lighting. Back to, we're going to talk little bit about tenant criteria. It's not just educating the developer that needs to happen. The developer then needs to buy in and educate the tenant. And so it's really the responsibility first, I think, you may not agree, of the tenant to create a great warmth on the sidewalk, so that the sidewalk pedestrian experience, even after the tenant has closed, is still interesting. In fact, when the tenant closes, it should look like a gallery. It should be a museum at 11 o'clock or 12 o'clock at night when people are still out carousing and maybe the retailers aren't open. Who doesn't love to walk past storefronts in New York City? I mean, that's a trip I take every year, just to look at the storefronts, and I love looking at them at night. So there is this hierarchy, as Chris says, but unless you get your tenant to help you, the rest of it is diminished in its value, in my opinion, and can actually be dilutive to the value, because you don't want your ambient lighting to overpower the story that the retailer is telling.
I'm just checking time, so I'm going to run through the next items a little bit quickly, and I don't want them to be any less important than the ones we've talked a lot about, because none of these are actually more important than one another. But branding of your district is essential from the very beginning. You may want to integrate it into banners, which we do a lot in Boston. You want to integrate it into your signage throughout with kiosks. You can actually add it onto your streetscape in the sidewalk, or actually in the road itself, with plaques and your ironwork that's going down onto the grates. And then we have plazas and civic spaces, which are really important because they can be places always to gather. You might want them to be restful spaces and places of celebration. But they're also very integral in terms of resting points or places where you gather and stop as you've gone along through past all the shops. And in all of these zones, whether it be your plaza and civic spaces or in the living room space on the sidewalk, you always want to think about artwork, because it just adds a personal, local sensibility or even monumental scale to the streetscape that you're trying to create. And that can be from the metalwork for your bike to adding water, and we all know the cows that go around to the US, or just local artists doing some artwork on the sidewalk. It just creates a human touch to maybe something that may be more formal.
I know I keep jumping in on yours, you haven't jumped in on mine yet. I want to tell just a quick story about art. I was building something in Shirlington, which is in Arlington, Virginia, and the community had a lot of power around art, and they had an obscene budget for art. It was ridiculous. And so the developer adjacent to us had plopped down this gigantic metal sculpture on this lawn in front of an apartment building, which I still say looks like some UFO fell and landed on the ground. Art is subjective, granted, but we didn't want that to happen. We just didn't feel like they did that out of laziness, partly because nobody wanted to think about it. So this way, one piece of art, bam, there you go, $100,000. So we went back and actually did a little homework and appealed to the planning board because we had such a huge art budget for such a small project, to allow us to use art as function. So could our benches be done by artists? Could our gates at the parking garage be done by artists? Could our fountains be done by artists? So that we actually had art. At first they were very, you're just trying to get away with not doing art. But it took a while for us to educate them. But it's just great when you actually have art as function as well as just art. It's really such a win-win. Okay, is it still? Oh, it's now my turn. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about storefronts, and again, just back to how important the diversity is. And it reminds me of when you know, the little houses on the hilltop or whatever from Weeds, where you have to make sure that every house has a different color, otherwise it'll all look terrible because they're all the same. So with storefronts, it's not just only what the storefront is that tenant is doing, but who's next door to them, or what are you thinking will happen next door to them? So I think it takes a lot of architectural design management when you're doing developments to make sure that you get good developments. I say now I don't make a decision without Chris. So the first thing is that the tenant design criteria has to be prepared up front. This has to be, I mean, this is something worth spending money on. This tenant design criteria, anybody who's working with developers, that you should push that like a drug. You cannot create a great place without great tenant design criteria, because the tenants are going to take the easiest way out, unless they're Apple or Crate and Barrel or people that really have their own design sensibility. I remember Jim Barry once saying to me, well, we don't design storefronts. And I said, what are you talking about? Look at the brand inside your store. It's so strong. How can you say you don't care about your storefront design? They just wanted a regular Conair aluminum with a couple of doors. So I think that the tenants have to be pushed and educated up front so that when they're thinking about the deal terms and what they can afford in rent, they're thinking about what the landlord is expecting them to put into the storefront. And that storefront, whether that tenant stays or not, is added value, and it creates intrinsic value in the place because it becomes attractive. So we actually have an example of a storefront recently, just a design criteria. The design criteria that I like to see is criteria that uses inspiration. Again, the tenants need to be driven a little here. So you have to say, look, I think this might be nice. Here are some examples of where we think your brand would look good in the context of whatever it is you've come up with your own design for the building. Rushing through this a little bit right now, but you understand the point. Dealing with signage, dealing with awnings, dealing with lighting. Sometimes design criteria is good if it creates a minimum standard. So I'm not trying to dictate to you what your store should look like, but I'm telling you what you can't do. And that's as important in the first 5 or 10 feet inside the store as it is on the outside. Is it still me?
Yeah. You can
Yeah?
do.
Well, and I mean, just generally signage, I think that when I look at any tenant, I also look at their signage, and I try to go around and see the best they've ever done in terms of their stores. Thank God for the internet these days. You can Google images
Right.
of a store and you can see 15 or 20 examples. And so you can point to it and say, you did this here, even though they're saying they don't want to spend that money. But blade signs to me are invaluable because they take some action inside that box that I was talking about. So now there's some action happening in this plane as well as this plane. And I really love to plan. You have to plan your blade signs so they're not interfering with each other. That's kind of tricky.
And I think signage always needs to be diverse. You don't need to have just one kind of blade sign. You want to have signage on your building. You want to have signage on a blade sign. You want to have signage on your awnings. Signage on a plaque to the side of the doors, or the decals actually on the windows. So it's not just one piece of branding. It has to happen over the entire facade treatment that they're proposing.
So there are two really good examples here. One is the Emac and Bolio's, which is in the middle on the left. The Emac store came after the West Elm store. The West Elm was allowed to put a big blade in between, and not on that demising pier, on that very thick demising pier. And the West Elm had that blade here and here and here. Well, that nobody really thought about. What about this little guy here? How are they going to get visibility from the side? And they were really upset, and we ended up having to give them that giant ice cream cone in order to make the deal. Which, I mean, not that I don't even know if I like it or not, but
Oh,
the
I
point
love it.
is, well, you love it, that's good. But the point is, it's too close to the blade. For me, it's too close to the West Elm blade. In this particular street, if it was in a street and everything was really right up against each other, but this street had a little bit more space.
How many other signs did they have then?
West Elm?
Yeah, they had several.
Yeah, they had way
So
too
they
many.
could sacrifice one.
They could easily
Right.
have sacrificed
But
one.
they
I tried
weren't going
that.
to. The deal was done.
They might sacrifice one someday
Even
soon,
if it
but
remained, it sort of still becomes a rhythm for
Oh, yeah.
their store, yet a backdrop for the ice cream.
right. And the other thing I'd like to point out, because Chris is too modest to point it out, but this sign in the middle here is the Guitar Center, which is a new flagship of theirs on Boylston Street. I don't know if any of you have seen it. And we really went to the mat with the BRA trying to get something that was very elegant but very large, something that really made a statement. That's actually the shape of a guitar along the side there. So that's, you can say more about what it is with a pick in the middle of it. But that is the kind of thing where if you took all your money and said, where should we spend our money, maybe you'd sacrifice a material somewhere else in order to take one focused effort to really make a statement. And signage is a really good place to do that.
Canopies are really same story as signage. You want to create as much diversity they can help define your place from very far along a street and catch your eye and draw you to there. The two on the left I love because they're so bright and engaging. You just kind of want to go there and be part of those cafes or restaurants. And they really help add color and diversity to your street alongside your signage, and you can see most of these have actually integrated their signage onto those awnings themselves. And an awning doesn't have to just be an awning, you can have a canopy. And canopies are, if you mix up lightweight fabric awnings with hard structured canopies, you get a nice diversity of materiality and scale as you're walking down the street. And then Robin and I are constantly talking to our, her tenants about how you create your sidewalk definition for a restaurateur or a cafe. We always say that it's better to have more transparency of sensibility between the person walking down the street and who's sitting at the dining table than creating a very hard wall of separation, because it's intriguing for the passerby to engage in, what's going on beside there, as opposed to not feel like they can be engaged, and likewise in the opposite direction. So we always prefer to have more transparency. That's not always the way that people want it to have that way. And you can do that with fencing or with different kinds of landscaping and be very creative with that design if you want to be. And it's very important to think about how you integrate that with your umbrellas and your awnings, as well as colorful, playful furniture. And if it wants to be very sedate, it can be very sedate. But the more color and diversity, you catch more eyes, and people want to come and join into your spot. And then we also think about, if you're not a restaurant, how do you create sidewalk presence? And I love this one on the right-hand side, where you can actually allow the tenant to actually get the carpet going into their store. It creates great character and branding technique, and it's actually a very traditional way. You don't see it happening very often nowadays. You can use planting and seating and art just to actually create a piece of presence that's not just the storefront, but you can actually stop and somebody might want to sit down or look at the flowers, but you're competing against the restaurants beside you. You want to bring some more objects.
Especially if you don't have a hallway zone.
Right. And then art, which we all believe is one of the great aspects of a streetscape, and it's great if a tenant can invest in it as much as the owner and have district-wide art. It creates local character and to an area, and it can be within the store if you want to have clear visibility into an art gallery, or actually have artwork that can be interchanged maybe throughout the year or every couple of years changed, but it creates a real interesting grain of fabric to the sidewalk that's a little bit more unique than only your landscaping, for example. And for me, I have to say, working with Robin has been a really amazing experience in terms of being an architect who always considered themselves a little bit of a snob in terms of what you did as an architect. And because you never really wanted to think, there's so much diversity in retail that you think you can't really touch it because you can't control it, but you actually can. The controlling nature of the architects still gets to allow for some diversity in the street by setting out all the guidelines with the client in the district-wide down to the tenant guidelines, and setting those out early. And it's been an incredible learning experience with the Samuels Group, and actually with Rob at my early stages at Elkis Manfredi, to draw me into that experience and realizing that it's really not the architect who necessarily has to be the person who defines the architecture of the building and how we, as the human being, walks along it. Because you don't want it all to be the same. You want to have variety, and you want to have fabric and grain and texture. And it's very important to allow that to somehow still feel natural and less controlled. And that's really the end of my piece.
Yeah, the last thing I want to say is that you really are still in charge.
Yeah, well,
The tenant just doesn't know it.
correct.
So you're really setting up
The guidelines.
the guidelines in which the tenant can express itself, like you design the gallery and then
Yes.
the artists come in. But we're finished now, if anybody wants to talk about it.
Great, well, thank you very much. We do have probably 20 minutes for discussion. Let me throw out a couple things to start us off. One of the things that you said about design guidelines and how important they are early, not only to codify the mission statement, if you will, but one thing that I've found in my work with tenants that's incredibly frustrating, and it was frustrating when I was an architect, it's almost even more frustrating now that I'm an architect for a developer, is, and comment on this, Robin, the leasing process generally, not always, but generally there are people at the tenant's office who are in charge of identifying places where the tenant wants to go, locations, and in negotiating the leases. And those people are not the tenant's design people. And generally what happens is that the way they're set up internally is, in order for them to authorize their design people to start to work with you, they need a lease in place. They won't start it until there's a lease. And so while you're trying to get all of these great conversations going with the tenant about, you could do this, you could do that, we really want you to be individual, but you have to, get up to a certain minimum bar, and you have to work within our enframement and everything, you're talking to the absolute wrong people. You're talking to people at the tenant who want to drive the absolute best bargain for them. They want to commit to the least amount of stuff that they have to do. And it's only after they have a signed lease with all of those limitations in place and all of the things that they don't want to do, negotiated out, that you give it to the designers. And my experience has been that then the designers for the tenants come back and they go, oh, I know you guys didn't have this in the lease, but we were thinking of putting a piece of art out here and putting some flowers in it. And you're like, oh, thank God, yes, please do it. But the process of negotiating with the wrong people. So one of the things that's really important about design guidelines is you just kind of plop them down on the, if they're all codified and arranged and bound and everything, you kind of plop them down on the desk and you say, all of our tenants have to, have to do this. And the leasing guys, they'll squawk a little bit, but they'll generally accept it, and you've kind of negotiated that stuff into the lease. So as much as we talk about all of these kind of things that are nice to do and they're really important and they create variety and they create place, the mechanism for doing them really comes through in the design guidelines. That's one little observation. Is that your experience in leasing, Robin?
Yeah, this is about human behavior. If you give people rules up front, they can learn to accept them better than if you try to tell them later what the rules are. And the retailers, the commerce of this is driven by your location. So if you have a good location and it's leasing well, you have so much more control than if you have a location that's not leasing well, in which case you might have to give up your criteria or put in your own stuff to make it still feel good. Or you're relying upon the towns to not accept certain trashy things or things that, we recently walked away from a tenant because they wouldn't open a store if you didn't let them have a balloon, one of those big helium balloons in an urban environment. So we were lucky enough to have another couple of tenants, but this tenant they don't open a single store in the United States without a balloon. Okay? That's kind of strange, but that's the way they are. But some tenants won't go away from that, because once they go away from that, then every landlord says, well, you didn't have a balloon there. So
They've heard about your internet trick.
that's right. Yeah, it's not rocket science. This is not rocket science.
So when you come, there are a number of, you were talking about what the town or the city requires.
Yeah.
So when you're negotiating with the tenant before the lease the accountants that do the lease.
Right.
Aren't you talking about all the creative stuff when you're trying to bring the tenant on board, or do you start with the leasing guy?
Well, you start with the leasing person.
Oh, you do?
Yeah. Do
So you
You
never
don't have a
get-
choice.
Would you like to come to my party? Then I ask you what clothing you're going to wear. But if I need you at my party, I'm going to ask you to come. And then you're going to say to me, well, you don't have enough people there, or the people don't have enough money there, or I already have 2 stores and I don't want to cannibalize. And so that negotiation is about geography, about demography, about it's all about the market. And then it goes to the physical realm. Can I fit here? Can I load here?
Right. It's not all the fun stuff.
But my question is, who within the tenant group?
It's a lease person. It's a real estate. I actually am the head of leasing at Samuels.
Yeah.
Crate and Barrel has a head of leasing. The
So
designer's
they
not
don't-
part of that. But
That was
see,
my point. The
Creighton-
designer's not at the table.
No,
And if
but-
you say,
but-
could I just talk to your designer, they'll say, no,
Yeah.
we need a lease.
They don't wanna spend money.
That's right.
Okay,
We
so
will
you-
not authorize a designer
So
to.
you're
But-
saying-
but,
you're not talking to a principal in the thing.
it
You're
depends on
talking-
the tenant. If a tenant has 2 stores, you're talking to the principal. If they have 6,000 stores,
Yeah,
you're talking
I
to
see.
the Northeast Regional head of real estate, and might even be their person who just handles Boston.
Yeah.
So it is an education. Again, there are many tenants. When you're working in the urban environment, it's very different than when you're working in a new center that you might be building. In the urban environment, you have a weird building. So the tenants are less, first of all, they want to be there because there's more business to be done, usually in an urban environment. And so the tenant might have a special, a unique store group. Some of the tenants we work with have unique store groups. The unique store groups have a much bigger budget to get involved earlier in the lease process than the guys that are dealing with the suburbs. They don't have any, in the suburbs, they can't change a wall, they can't change a dimension, they can't, no, you gotta give me my prototype or I'm not coming. Whereas in the city, they'll say, well, all right, if I have to, I'll go on 2 floors because I want to be on Newbury Street. So there is no really hard and fast rule, but generally speaking, if you're in the most places in the United States, you're going to talk to the real estate person, and unless that person is educated enough to see possibility, you're not going to get that person to give you the designer.
What you come to me to when you starting to talk to your leasing guy on the
Right.
tenant side is that I'll often put together a design which is a marketing piece to draw them into a potential vision. It's not to say that that's what's in any way going to be in the long term,
Right.
and we try to achieve all of those guidelines, and it's purely a marketing
It's
piece.
like a mannequin.
Yeah.
That's what it is. I'm just showing you what your dress is going to look like on
Right.
you. And then some tenants can't see it until you actually do it for them. I'll tell you a quick little funny story. We're trying to lease a piece of real estate in the Watertown area, and it's a warehouse, and we really want to put a retailer in there. And so we had Chris's company drew a rendering for us, a perspective, and the tenant came back and said, "You didn't put the trees in. We can't see our storefront through those trees," which was absolutely true. So our leasing person went to the developer and said, "Can you cut down those trees?" You know, we can't.
Right.
So,
There has to be a balance of that marketing piece.
What did the city say about cutting down the trees?
we weren't there yet. We were just internally imagining if we could cut down the trees.
But don't you integrate all the city regulations and codes into the guidelines so that they're part and parcel?
Well, I'll tell you what, you might even step back a step and say, what do I need to do in this town? Let's say I'm deciding if I want to build in a place, like Arlington, Virginia, which I told you about, which I spoke earlier about the art. So we had to actually say to those people actually approve every storefront in the whole entire community. So if you're building a shopping center and it has 50 storefronts, every tenant has to go before the planning board. So we convinced them with a book this thick with materials and da-da-da-da-da, and that thing cost tens of thousands of
Right.
dollars. If we stay within these guidelines, you do not need to approve it. The building department can approve it so building department, here you go, here are your guidelines. Oh, is it made out of something other than plastic? Da-da-da? Okay, check. Did the lights, the signs do not have da-da? Check. So that was huge effort because you would never want to have to go, God forbid, to a group of people who are volunteering and let them pick your storefronts.
That's like an as of right.
We
Yeah,
were trying
and-
to make it an as of right. It was very, very tough.
But
It
in
was-
Boston, it's a little different because they need to review everything and every aspect.
But if you stay pretty close to those,
No, they don't
always the
sometimes
case.
even want
Not
that.
always the
In
case.
Paris.
In Boston, they can't. They might want it. They might want, like when we went to the Guitar Center. If we stayed within what were the guidelines, they weren't going to get what they wanted.
Right.
They wanted something, but they didn't know what they wanted. So
But
then
we
you have
also-
to design things until you figure out what they want. So you have two constituencies as the developer. I'm sorry, I'll get yours. You have the jurisdiction, which you hope you can educate, and that if you've got smart people on board, that's great. And then you have to push the tenant and manage that. You're sort of brokering that deal. I'm sorry, you were waiting.
So yeah, you spoke in the very beginning about establishing a vision, or you used a number of terms, and I think that the back story on that was giving back to the community. And I would be curious to see some or hear some examples. I was sort of listening for that in the presentation and didn't quite pick it up as to what, the projects that you referred to and or the projects that you're doing yourself, what they did to give back to the community. Or what,
I may not
or
have-
maybe the step back is what the vision, what
Yeah,
kind of vision
I
are
didn't
you
say
talking
give back
about?
to the community. I said improve the quality of life in the communities in which
Okay.
we do business.
Yeah,
And for
okay,
me,
whatever, yeah.
taking an ugly place and having it be aesthetically pleasing and considering what the pedestrian or resident or local business worker might have comfort walking around in, that's improving the quality of life.
Yeah.
So taking a place that otherwise might be not well lit, not have parks, not have good, interesting retail, is not served well. We don't have enough coffee shops, or we need a nail salon, or whatever it is. Just listening to what might improve the quality of life in the community.
Yeah, so it's a pretty generic thing. I mean, the example I keep thinking of a great streetscape is in Miami Beach, Lincoln Road.
Right,
Road.
exactly. That's a great
And,
street.
I'm trying, I don't know the story of the development of that. I think it was a street at one time.
It was, and they
Right,
closed
it
it.
was.
Yeah,
traffic.
and it got close to traffic, but one of the things that seems to keep it alive is there are institutions. I mean, there are lots of things that I think are really valuable and, or it's a very unique place, but
It
it
is.
does have institutions like theaters and stuff like that.
Right.
And so, I don't know, but it feels really integrated in the community too. There's reasons for residents to be there. There are,
Well,
theater
having
brings a certain
civic,
kind of population.
when you
the
talk
beach
about
brings another kind of population.
when
so-
you talk about anchoring your space,
Yeah.
there are many different types of anchors. A grocery is an anchor, a civic use is an anchor. So that's that would be more of a discussion about merchandising, which we weren't really talking about today, but civic uses are to draw and attract a civic
Essential.
use is very essential.
And it was very traditional in urban
right,
planning
that's right.
to have your library
Town hall,
or your
your
town
library,
hall, and there's less of that in your urban planning today
Right.
because it's not driven by a dollar sign.
And also
And
the
so how do you create
communities-
that balance?
Right, and the communities don't. The government is basically shrinking its space, and so
Correct.
it's not, and it's consolidating. It's putting it all in one place, and so you don't get to have.
But I would like to add to the community question. I always say that a lot of the design aspects, what I do on a day-to-day basis, not what necessarily Robin does, comes down to scale. And community is about scale, what's tangible, how they perceive it. And if you create urban environments that are on such an enormous scale that the human being feels that they're overwhelmed, you're not giving back to the community. And
Right.
everything that we design in all of our urban landscapes is about scale. You got to always talk about scale. How does it bring it down to what you touch and what you see, and it feels that it's down at our level rather than being too grand. And that allows the resident and the person who's there longest during the day or coming for just 8 hours a day feel like they're inhabiting a human scale environment as opposed to an overwhelming, because it's very easy. I mean, even in Chicago and Michigan Avenue, there are stores on that. There are 3 stories tall,
Crate and Barrel.
they define. Well, Crate and Barrel is a very good example of good scale management, but there are stores that really haven't managed that scale question. And so you can have good 3-story scale design
Right.
and poor 3-story scale design, but it's always about bringing it down. I keep reminding myself constantly, you remember you're a human, you know, and you're only so
You're
tall.
not a bird.
Yeah.